Okay, so due to some timetabling changes that were last minute, we don't have time to revise Holzel at all in class. So I'm going to quickly share with you some of the slides that we used, and hopefully this will help you revise. So this is the third of the biological studies in the biological approach, and personally I think it's the most difficult for several reasons. You have several IVs, several DVs, not as clear cut as maybe Dement and Kleitman, where you have older technology. Here we have more sophisticated technology by using an MRI to see what's happening in the brain. And this is a new study to the syllabus. And personally, I think it's a little strange to choose because you are studying parts of the brain, but you don't really need to know what their function is. You just need to know some of the correlational information about how gray matter is accruing in these concentrated areas. The 21st century, a lot of new research has been published about mindfulness meditation. We've known for many years, for example, that people who meditate or do some sort of mindfulness practice have shown improvements in various aspects of their lives. But at this point, we don't really have much of the empirical evidence for what is actually happening. Okay, first of all, what is mindfulness? Well, to read this quote, it involves the practice of meditation and other techniques and strategies to enhance paying attention on purpose in the present moment. Which honestly, to people who don't do this type of thing, doesn't sound that amazing. But if you think about your life, maybe you're negotiating traffic while listening to music on your earpods and you're eating a Danish as you're walking. You're negotiating several things at once, but you're not really mindful of what's happening. We're kind of a busy people that nowadays, we multitask. And so this kind of slows you down and draws your attention inward. When I think about stuff like this, I think about a line or a few lines from the movie Glengarry Glen Ross from the early 90s, one of my favorite movies, where Al Pacino's character is saying, "Our life is either looking back or looking forward. That's our life. Where's the moment?" And essentially what mindfulness meditation does is it puts you in the moment. When most people think of meditation, I know I had this conception when I first heard about these type of practices. People believe you have to empty yourself, you have to empty your mind. And that's virtually impossible. And so modern people who guide you through these types of practices acknowledge this, and they say, it's okay if a stray thought comes into your mind. Maybe put it away or don't judge based on the thought you just had. And if you want to figure out what modern mindfulness practice is, of course, you could listen to some, podcasts or some videos that help you do it, or you could look at a questionnaire called the FFMQ. And these are the 5 facets of mindfulness questionnaire. And these 5 subscales kind of encapsulate what mindfulness practice is. And there are these 5 things in the blue text here. You become observant of your inner states. You describe or take note of the stimuli around you, but you shouldn't get too lost or caught up in them emotionally. You become very aware of the purpose of the actions you're doing in the present moment. And very important, as things are happening, you're not judging. You're being non-judgmental, especially to yourself, and you're not being reactive. You're not getting emotionally stimulated by what's happening. You're not dwelling on the negative, for example. All right, so the name of the program is MBSR, which stands for Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction. We're going to ask people to take part in this who have never actually done a program like this before. And that's kind of important because that acts as a control, so they should have an equal baseline of experience going into this experiment. Just be aware there's a lot of acronyms in this study, so that's part of the difficulty with it. MBSR, FFMQ, of course, MRI. So just take some time to get to know these acronyms. And again, I think the best way to study this stuff is perhaps to experience it yourself. So sometimes we ask students to reflect upon what they got out of a mindfulness exercise that you could download or listen to online. Okay, so John Kabat-Zinn is largely responsible for the tenets of mindfulness practice as it's currently used in wide circles. So if you want to watch more about John Kabat-Zinn, I recommend you put him in a search bar and see what he has to say. But his name is mentioned in the background. What's also mentioned in the background is the plethora of studies that have been done recently that have looked into the effects of mindfulness practice. So it's been looked at in regard to things like depression, anxiety, substance abuse, eating disorders, and chronic pain. Just as a side note, this study here on eating disorders is by Katie Tapper, who you will see next year in A2 if you do the health psychology unit. She's largely responsible for, promoting good eating in children. So yeah, that's a name to maybe keep in mind for later. All right, let's go into the now, speaking of the moment. So the now is an experiment. And it's not a large population, which is to be expected because there's a lot of commitment involved, not just to do the MSBR, did I say MSBR? MBSR training, but also to do the MRIs. And MRIs, if you've ever been in that kind of machine before, it's not the most comfortable thing for all people, and it takes a while for good scans. All right. To jump to evaluation a little bit early, you see that the number 18 has been crossed out and replaced with 16 because 2 people exercised their right to withdraw. Some people think they could handle an MRI, and then you get inside of it and you're like freaking out a little bit because it's so cramped, and maybe you didn't report that you were claustrophobic, but maybe you discovered maybe I am claustrophobic, or I don't like the noise that this machine is making, or something like that. They give you a little squeeze ball. If you've ever been in the MRI, you get this little plastic squeeze ball. This is my Playmobil MRI playset for children of all ages, except there are some small parts, so be careful. Make sure you remove them if you're using it with a 3-year-old. But you see that the action figure here is grabbing onto this little squeeze contraption. And if you use it, you're indicating to the experimenter that you would like to stop the procedures. So discomfort is often expected in this type of contraption. Now that we have our participants, and you could see their details of their makeup over there, their gender, their average age, we can now start the experiment. Okay, so we're going to have half the participants, or roughly half the participants, enter this MBSR training, and it's going to take about 8 weeks to do, or exactly 8 weeks, I should say. And then we're going to have that control group for comparison. So if you have a control group, the obvious design of this study is independent groups. So are you either in condition A or condition B? However, we're also going to do before and after measurements. We're going to see both groups before the 8-week program begins and then after the 8-week program begins. So we also have before and after data. So those are 2 of the key manipulated variables. The DVs, while we're here, we should talk about are as follows. Some of the DVs are self-reported, and some of the DVs are more objectively reported. So if we look at the first DV here, we're looking for potential increases in gray matter concentration. Now, what is gray matter, you may ask? Gray matter, in short, is essential for various cognitive functions, including things like memory and movement. So we're going to look for that stuff. The second DV is the self-report, and that has to do with how much people actually engage with the facets of mindfulness in their everyday life. Things like, being aware of a current situation, not being judgmental. We're going to look at that self-report later, so let's hold off on that. And I saw that one textbook reported a third DV, and that had to do with how much time people spent doing various exercises that were taught to them in the program at home. Now, personally, I don't really think that's a DV. I guess you could say that they could check both the control group and the experimental group. But my understanding is they only checked it with the experimental group. So I am not going to put that as a DV. However, you should know that was one of the measurements taken in the study. It's one of the results reported. All right. So in short, you have 2 DVs, but 3 categories of results: fMRI, FFMQ, and how much exercise or what types of exercise were done by the people that were not in the control group. So we're using MRI as our main source of information, and this is primarily what makes the study biological. We're looking for those increases in gray matter in various regions of interest. We're looking in specific areas because we've seen research done before with mindfulness and MRIs, and so we have a rough idea of where to look. There's many good things about using an MRI. Obviously, the weakness, we'll talk later, of course, more about this, would be ecological validity, and there could be confounding variables of people being stressed in this environment. But for the most part, it's really, really helpful for finding things that are usually not done without being invasive. So what do I mean by that? Usually you need to have someone ingest something or have some more radical means of looking inside of a person. So that, of course, is a good thing. Now, sometimes there is confusion about whether an MRI provides quantitative or qualitative information because, after all, it is a picture. It's not a numeric representation, but there are ways to create numeric representations. One of those ways is a technique called voxel-based morphometry. And this is a phrase you've seen several times in the textbook or in the primary source, and it doesn't need to be too technically understood. It's actually easier to talk about if we talked about, let's say, an fMRI, which measures function. But when it comes to an MRI, which kind of measures the structure of the brain, it's a little bit more complicated and something that requires a lot of software to figure out. Essentially, you're looking at structures in the brain three-dimensionally, so you're not just looking at a single image, which will be pixel-based. You're looking at a series of images that are superimposed over each other, and therefore creating a third dimension called a voxel. And the way this is partly accomplished is by having several slices of the same portion of the brain across a different axis. So they call these sagittal slices in the study. And what do we mean by sagittal? It's essentially moving across the axis that sticks out from your belly button. And that's all that means. So you're looking essentially at the brain in a profile, not from the top, but looking at it from the side. Okay, and this is the second method, again, of looking at the internal happenings in the brain this semester. The first time we saw a tool was the EEG, and a lot of the benefits of EEG apply here to an MRI. So, for example, the data could be quantitative. It doesn't require much interpretation. It's not subjective. Another benefit, which is similar to an EEG, again, it's non-invasive. The drawbacks are a little bit different. A drawback of using it would be that you are in a restricted space. Well, I guess that's kind of similar to an EEG. You really can't move around too much if you're hooked up to electrodes. So it is going to affect ecological validity and mundane realism. It's something you don't do every day. And the last negative is that it is a tight space, and so anxiety could be felt, and those anxious feelings could impact the results. But that's more true for an fMRI than for an MRI. So that's not really that big a deal because we're measuring long-term changes, not short-term ranges. And if you don't know what an fMRI is, don't worry about it, but that's just like a little side note there. All right, so bringing back the background into this, the areas we're looking for, again, are based upon things that were seen in previous research. So they have these things called ROI, or regions of interest, and there are several. One of the big places to look is something called the interior insula, which is believed to be associated with introspective feelings, or feelings of looking internally at yourself. And it stands to reason that if you're doing mindfulness practice, there will be changes in the insula. We'll talk more about the insula in the results section. The less complicated way to take measures, of course, is self-report using something like a Likert scale. And there are 39 items on this FFMQ. We already talked about what the 5 subscales are, and here they are reproduced again. And there's something called reverse scoring, which we'll explain later, but that's going to help with our judgment of this tool as being perhaps something that's reliable, or actually I should say something that is valid. Okay, let's look at both measures across a timeline to get a better understanding of how this experiment works. As I said before, there are before and after measures, so we can call these repeated measures, and there are between groups or independent measures between the control and the experimental group. It's an 8-week timetable, and we're roughly doing things around the same time for each participant. Okay, so they're doing the questionnaire and the MRI. 8 weeks later, they're doing the questionnaire and the MRI. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but it might be worth pausing on it and just getting a feel for the whole experiment. Okay, going to the results. So here we see various regions of interest that were implicated as having shown improvements in gray matter concentration after the program was over. You'll notice here, perhaps, that the thing we talked about just a few moments ago, the insula, doesn't really show any changes or any significant changes. And the authors of the study say that perhaps this has to do with it was only 8 weeks, that maybe changes in the insula require more commitment or more time than just 8 weeks. However, we can see gray matter concentration increase in these three areas: the lateral cerebellum, the posterior cingulate cortex, and the temporal parietal junction. And it's very clearly laid out using these colors, okay, blue versus red. Would Cambridge expect you to have any sort of quantitative results for these? I think that would be a little unrealistic to ask people to actually remember the quantitative volumes of the gray matter concentration. So I'm going to probably guess no. It doesn't mean we don't need to know numbers, but for this point, I think we could just make comparisons. It's already difficult enough to remember these names of the regions. So based upon these results, we haven't looked at the FFMQ results or the exercise results, but just based upon these results alone, we could perhaps make a conclusion that the brain does have some plasticity. What does that mean? Brain plasticity refers to the ability to make structural changes in the brain according to usually external stimuli or changes in a person's life. So it could be about reorganizing structures, changing the pathways of the brain, elongating neurons. In short, just are changes possible? And typically we know that the brain is plastic, but usually we associate this plasticity with young people, people that are developing. After you hit a certain age, it's believed the brain is not as plastic or pliable as it is with young people. However, if you show the commitment, there are structural changes that are indeed possible. Okay, so that's just the brain part. What about the other results? Well, we could also know something about which activities were the most used by the people in the program. What kind of things did they like to do at home? Now, they were required to do things in a group at 2.5 hours per week, with one exception being the 6th week where they had to do like a full day seminar or a longer seminar. But at home, they were encouraged to do these things on their own. So you can see on the screen various mean values for how many minutes they spent doing things like body scan or yoga or sitting meditation. One thing you might want to be mindful of is that this is a small group. It's only 16 people. And so having an outlier, having a person who's really committed to these could really impact the results quite profoundly. So when you look at the results in the textbook or in the original article, you'll see that there are some wide standards of deviation. And so this could be a critical point that we make about the study, saying things like, well, yeah, it shows that these people were committed, but there were some people that were more committed than others. But the good news is, regardless of how much their commitment was, the improvements were seen in all people, not just people who did the exercises for long periods of time. So as far as the FFMQ score results go, 3 out of the 5 subscales have shown significant increases in the experimental group. When I say significant, I mean mathematically significant. The other 2 may have had changes, but the problem is that they don't work out mathematically to show that it's because of the IV having an impact on the DV. So long story short, 3 of the 5 categories increased significantly enough to claim that the IV is having an impact on those 3 subscales. And just in case it's not clear, the 3 subscales that improved significantly are in the green boxes on the screen. Okay, lastly, we usually like to go with evaluations. What are some strengths? What are some weaknesses? Okay, so we could talk about some of the typical things we do when we evaluate, namely GRAVE, and we talked a little bit about validity throughout the presentation, a little bit about generalizability. I will talk about reliability in a few slides later, but let's jump down to what makes this study unique from most of the other studies this year, and that is its longitudinal nature. So if they said, describe the strengths and weaknesses of the study, include a discussion of longitudinal design, then I hope you have something to say. One of the particular reasons why this is longitudinal as opposed to some of the other studies, which are shorter, is because when it comes to changing your brain, when it comes to brain plasticity, especially at older ages, it takes a long time for these changes to happen. You can't just expect to do one mindfulness training and then all of a sudden, bam, you have more gray matter. That would be as ridiculous as saying, I'm going to go to the gym on Tuesday and then on Wednesday, I'm going to be tested for my physical strength. Bodily changes take a long time to happen. And especially if you're older, brain plasticity is much less likely than in young people. So we need those 8 weeks at least. I think the study could be even longer. Who knows what would happen after a year? Maybe we'll see changes in the insular after all. So again, typical things you could evaluate on, but what makes it unique is longitudinal design or longitudinal length. Coming back to validity, things that are controlled for participants and things that are controlled for the environment, participant variables and situational variables. As we saw in the slide earlier, there were several things that both the control group and the experimental group had in common. For example, they were not claustrophobic, they had no metallic implants, they were all right-handed. And some people are confused about why studies that use MRIs have same-handedness. Some people believe that if you had left-handed people in the study, that would be an extraneous or confounding variable due to what we call brain lateralization. If you are left-handed, you're more likely to have your brain be right dominant. Another way of putting that is people who are left-handed may have reverse brains than people who are right-handed. So to leave nothing to chance about that, we're going to make sure that everyone is right-handed. If you want to know more about hand dominance or brain dominance, I suggest you look into that. But for the purposes of our short discussion, just know they were all right-handed because we want to make sure their brains are similar. Okay, so those are participant variables. What are some of the uncontrolled things about the people? So the first thing I wrote here is age diversity. Now, if you look at the mean age of both the experimental group and the control group, you'll notice that they're actually both in their late 30s, which is great. That seems to be matched. But if you look a little closer, the standard deviation for the control group is about twice that of the experimental group. So you could say, yeah, they're the same age kind of, but the spread around the mean, the diversity of ages is much different in the control group. And of course, their gender ratios are not perfectly matched. So you could talk about that as well. Controlled situational variables are things that usually happen in the MBSR program where we are controlling the amount of time, maybe we're controlling the level of instruction, as well as the things that occur in the MRI facility as well. Those are all controlled. You're not going to have many unique experiences in an MRI. However, uncontrolled situations, there's several things you could say. And I won't read through all of these, but one thing that was pointed out, which I think is quite smart, is that there may be a social benefit to the weekly meetings. And what I mean by that, or what they might mean by that, is that it's maybe not the exercise program itself. It might not be the mindfulness program that's having the impact, but the fact that these people are even being social at all. They're leaving the house. They're being in society. So who's to say that it's actually the program? Maybe it's the fact that you're connecting with people rather than staying home watching Netflix that's actually improving these various regions of gray matter concentration in your brain. Okay, so all of this has to do with validity. Some good stuff and some stuff that's really hard to control. I don't know if you could control the social aspect unless you force the control group to be social at a bar at the same time. I don't know, but it's not easy to do. The last thing I want to talk about with validity is the nature of the FFMQ. And this is actually kind of important also for next year in A2. A2, you're going to see a lot of self-report questionnaires, regardless of what you study, whether it's clinical, consumer, organizations, or health. And the best questionnaires, especially if they're long, will have something called reverse scoring. essentially what that means is that in the questions, you can't just sum up the numbers. Sometimes a number will have a negative value and sometimes it'll have a positive value. And this could be shown in the example I've written here. Let's say you were asked, I like to watch a lot of action movies, and you hit 4, agree. And then you go to the next question, and then you say agree again. Well, those two questions are kind of asking the same thing, but now you've contradicted yourself. And one of the reasons why people do reverse scoring is to make sure people don't feel compelled to just answer high on all the questions. You actually have to read the questions to figure out and really think about what your response is. A badly designed questionnaire will often have it just be in one direction. So I've seen students fill out teacher surveys where they rate their teachers. And, he's very nice, 4. He greets me at the door, 4. He assigns challenging homework, 4. And they just go 4 all the way down the line so that they give a positive result to the teacher, not actually thinking about what they're reading. So yeah, this is good practice for anybody who wants to make a good questionnaire. Have reverse scoring. So you're not just going to sum up everything. You have to do a little bit more calculation than just addition. Okay, the last thing I want to mention is if you look at the primary source document, it could be kind of intimidating. There's a lot of detail that you don't need. And even when peers, professionals are reading this, sometimes they feel like they don't need it. But if they wanted to replicate the study, do it for themselves, play it at home, or maybe even critique the methods, they would look at the various measurement tools that were used. So this article, while not super difficult, is chock full of technical language having to do with hardware and software. But what does that have to do with you? Well, if you're writing about the strengths and weaknesses of the study, you could be mentioning some of the standardization that is going on in the article. So for example, what type of MRI machine is it? What type of software is being used, etc. This is something I would not spend a lot of time on, but I would be aware of some of it just in case I want to talk about standardized procedures. Okay guys, so that was the Holzel study, and it falls in the biological approach, and with like all the biological approaches and all the learning approach studies, it's very likely you'll be asked about nature versus nurture. So this is something to consider for Dementi-Kleitman, for monkeys and toys, for Bandura, things like that. So is this study likely to fall on the nature or nurture side of the debate? Now, if it's biological, we tend to think nature, right? But because we had some intervention program, I would argue this is more about the nurture side of the debate. So it's not as easy as just saying biology is nature and learning is nurture. Sometimes there are some surprises. All right, and there's a slide just reminding us again what the biological approach actually is. I hope this was useful, and you have exams coming up very shortly, so good luck with that. Remember to get there early, especially with some of the new regulations that have just been enacted by Cambridge. Have a great day.